Solo Leveling by Chu Gong. Chapter 52 Part 1 The King of Giants. Wait a minute. Jinwoo hurriedly brought the notification window up again. He had no time to celebrate the quadruple level-ups as he zeroed in on the first message. He was stunned. You have defeated an enemy. That wasn't the boss? Jinwoo's surprised stare shifted to the giant with dull, lifeless eyes. Its strength and imposing aura had been completely different from the other giants and had shocked even Jinwoo. There was no way it hadn't been the boss of the dungeon, but here the system was, claiming it was a regular old magic beast. Boss! Jinho excitedly called out to him as he ran toward Jinwoo. But Jinwoo urgently signaled for him to freeze. Ah! Whether he was listening to Jinwoo or something had spooked him, Jinho froze in his tracks. Jinwoo's expression turned grave. He hadn't received the customary notification that he defeated the master of the dungeon, which meant the raid wasn't over. And that wasn't the only weird thing. There was no sign of the black smoke coming from the giant's corpse that indicated shadow extraction was possible. Right on cue, he heard a chime. Ping! You cannot extract a shadow. What's going on? As Jinwoo pondered the many unexpected turns of events, he heard the sound of cracking bones. The giant's jaw was moving. Its mouth opened, and Jinwoo caught a glimpse of a humanoid figure. He immediately dropped into a battle stance, light glinting off the sharp blades of the two daggers he'd summoned. However, the voice that emerged from the giant's mouth sounded familiar. My king, it is but your simple servant. Baru emerged, as courteous to Jinwoo as ever. Oh, it was just you. Jinwoo relaxed. Baru's presence had been indistinguishable from the giant's, masked by the magic beast's tremendous levels of mana. Jinwoo sent the daggers back to inventory after confirming Baru's identity. The Ant King was drenched in the giant's guts and blood. It was clear how much effort he'd exerted hacking away at the giant's innards. Jinwoo smiled and opened his mouth to praise Baru but paused and wrinkled his nose. What the heck is that smell? The disgusting stench grew worse as Baru drew closer. Baru was also able to smell the fluids and wore the same expression of disgust. The ant stopped right in front of Jinwoo and bowed. Okay then. Jinwoo was about to pat Baru on the shoulder for a job well done, but changed his mind upon spotting an unidentified yellow liquid. Good job, Baru. Thank you, my liege. Baru sounded uncharacteristically curt. In any case, this was not the time to be concerned about the yellow mystery goo. If this behemoth wasn't the master of the dungeon, then where would he find it? VMMM. The air around them started to subtly vibrate. Jinwoo's defenses were up again. A split second later, Baru sensed it too, and immediately moved to shield his master. Scraw! A sudden gale storm hit them. Ugh! Jinwoo gritted his teeth. Wind forceful enough to uproot trees blew through them in a blink of an eye, then calmed. Thinking the danger had passed, Baru moved from his spot in front of Jinwoo. The hunter scanned his surroundings, then gasped as he realized what had happened. No way! That was no whirlwind. It was the giant releasing its copious stores of mana. The resulting blast had swept away everything in their vicinity. What happened to Jinho? Jinwoo spun around to where Jinho had been standing, and was relieved to find him safe in Igris's arms. Phew. Jinwoo inspected the direction in which the magic power had headed. Every iota of mana formerly housed within the dead giant had been sucked into the gate, as if the gate had swallowed it up. The black membrane that used to seal off the gate had been shattered long ago during the dungeon break, so they could clearly see the world inside. VMMM. The vibrations in the air let out a low hum. Despite the countless things Jinwoo had experienced, he had never seen anything like this before. There's something in there. His perception stat was picking up something. Jinwoo peered into the depths. Whatever was in there made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He simultaneously felt goosebumps forming and chills up his spine. Ba dump, be a dump, be a dump. Jinwoo's heartbeat accelerated, as if resonating with the vibrations. Boss! Step by cautious step, Jinho approached Jinwoo and peered at the gate. Given the danger, Jinwoo looked at Jinho and emphasized, "Wait here for me." "Yes, boss." Jinho obediently nodded. As much as he wanted to tag along, he had a feeling he would only be a burden. Satisfied with Jinho's answer, Jinwoo stepped through the gate with his shadow soldiers. Whoa, this is... High-ranked dungeons tended to be large, but none had ever come close to this. This is huge. He was convinced that the word huge existed purely to describe this place. He had to swallow his gasp as he walked through the endlessly high and wide passage. He proceeded without making a single noise. This had been his modus operandi ever since he had been a low-rank hunter, incapable of doing much to guard himself against magic beasts. But the habit persisted even after he distinguished himself as an S-rank hunter. An abundance of caution was never a bad thing. Jinwoo's eyes glittered in the dark. He kept his guard up as he advanced farther into the dungeon. Jinwoo's soldiers, having fully recovered from the fierce battle, quietly followed. How long had they been walking? Jinwoo stopped, and Baru, who was right behind him, gestured to the rest of the army. As a creature made to live in colonies, Baru was good at commanding large groups. The entire Shadow army came to a halt. Baru leaned in to say something. "My king!" "Shoo!" Jinwoo held up his index finger. "Do you hear that?" Baru focused his ears and then nodded. "I do." Baru could hear it too. Laughter, faint enough that only someone of Baru's caliber could perceive it, came from the end of the dungeon where the boss was supposed to be. The masculine-sounding laugh continued in the distance, as if whoever it was sincerely happy about something. Jinwoo was puzzled. Despite the darkness, the opponent should have detected Jinwoo's approach as well as the numbers of the Shadow army at this distance. Yet it's laughing it up? Of course, Jinwoo also measured up his opponent. The ominous energy making it harder to breathe was even stronger than that of the boss giant. However, Jinwoo himself was no slouch. He unleashed his full mana. Waves of magic rippled around Jinwoo, emanating incredible power strong enough to eliminate the Shadow soldiers in his vicinity if he'd so elected. Ha ha ha. The opponent continued to laugh. Jinwoo found himself grinning as well. What an intriguing fellow. He kept smiling as he entered the boss's lair, the wide-open space where the enormous giant had been housed. Jinwoo headed toward the source of the laughter without hesitation. The Shadow soldiers marched behind him. Stomp, 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 stomp. The army of minions cloaked in black smoke and moving in perfect order should have been enough to intimidate the enemy. However, ha ha ha! That wasn't the case for the man draped in chains from the neck down. He wasn't just bound by the black chains tethered to the wall of the dungeon. Some of them pierced the man's body. One had to wonder what heinous crime this wretched soul had committed to be punished so horribly. Jinwoo frowned, but the fellow beamed at him as if greeting a dear friend. "It's completely, utterly ridiculous. All of you detestable rulers, feast your eyes on the one who found me first." Jinwoo stopped at a distance as the prisoner continued his rant. "The chains! Please unlock these chains. I know the ruler's plan. We must quickly inform the other monarchs." The man suddenly stopped, and the joy in his eyes faded. The man and Jinwoo carefully scrutinized each other. It was then that Jinwoo realized his face was the same as that of the last, humongous giant. He isn't human. The man's magic energy felt different from a human's. He also fluently spoke the language of magic beasts. But why was a magic beast chained up inside the dungeon? Many types of bosses have been found in gates over the last 10 years, but never one imprisoned like this. At least the mysterious man had given him a potential hint with the word rulers. There was a short pause before the prisoner spoke again. "You're not the one I know." Jinwoo didn't know who he'd been mistaken for, but he wasn't going to deny anything. He had never seen this guy's face before today, either. "Did the rulers or whoever do this to you?" Jinwoo asked. "I am being used as the foundation stone for the real war." This was a first for Jinwoo. He had repeatedly tried to probe intelligent magic beasts, but none had been able to explain their origins. However, the magic beast now, before him, had revealed the purpose of his existence. He was the cornerstone upon which the real war was going to be built. Whether he was telling the truth or not, this could serve as a clue. "Who are these rulers?" "The longtime enemies of the monarchs." Monarchs. Jinwoo remembered something the angel statue had mentioned when cornered. Something about the other monarchs not sitting by and letting things happen. Wherever the other monarchs were, Jinwoo had a feeling one was currently in front of him. "So those rulers chained you up like this because—" "Yes," the man replied sorrowfully. "I am one of the monarchs," he continued desperately. "It's likely both the monarchs and rulers are after you. You don't have enough power to deal with both sides as you are. You'll need more influence." Jinwoo had a hard time keeping up with him, but one word caught his attention. "Influence?" The man nodded. "Release me, and I shall help you." Jinwoo couldn't believe what he was hearing. Who was helping whom now? A magic beast wanted to help a human? Jinwoo was so taken aback, he couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why should I believe you?" The man was resolute. "I will make you believe me." He chanted a spell, his lips moving like a recording sped up 100 times. As he did, the dormant magic power within the lair began swirling around him, and Jinwoo instantly summoned his daggers in reply. Had there been any hostility behind the magic, Jinwoo would have stuck a dagger straight in the man's forehead, but he remained patient. The amount of mana the prisoner was manipulating was extremely small compared to what either he or Jinwoo wielded, and the hunter sensed no hostility. Jinwoo waited, prepared to use dagger barrage if necessary. The tension in the air pricked his skin like a needle. Finally, the man finished chanting in the strange language, and a chime signaled an incoming notification. Regia, the king of giants and monarch of the beginning, has activated the Oath of Sincerity, negotiation. Once the Oath of Sincerity, negotiation, is accepted, both the caster and the recipient cannot lie. Would you like to accept the Oath of Sincerity, negotiation? Y/N. Jinwoo's eyes were drawn to the man's title, the King of Giants. Jinwoo recalled all the giants he had felled. That also explained why the one guarding the gate had worn the same face. The man wordlessly awaited Jinwoo's decision. "What should I do?" Jinwoo stared at the blinking yes and no buttons as he debated. Considering he had received a message from the system about it, this would affect him for sure. But it was clear which of them would be at a greater disadvantage. It's definitely his loss. Jinwoo had the upper hand. As cold-hearted as it sounded, he could always just kill the guy if he asked a question Jinwoo couldn't answer. Besides, it was his idea to begin with, and Jinwoo wasn't a newbie who would feel guilty killing a magic beast. Yes. Ping. The system signaled with another chime that the deal was done. The Oath of Sincerity, negotiation has been activated. The caster and the recipient cannot lie to each other until both parties mutually agree to cancel the oath. As soon as Jinwu accepted, the King of Giants reiterated what he had said earlier. "Release me, and I shall help you." MMPH. MMPH. Jinwu was bewildered. It was as if his throat had been sealed. The King of Giants burst into laughter. "Yes, that is the oath of sincerity." He really had been affected. Jinwu had been testing it by trying to say, "I trust you completely. I'll unchain you right away." The oath of sincerity, huh? His heart raced after experiencing it firsthand. He couldn't trust the monarch completely yet, since there was still the method of withholding information. Rather, Jinwu was more cautious than before the oath had been struck. "Why can you talk freely but not other magic beasts?" Magic beasts? Creatures that emerge from gates. Oh, you mean denizens of chaos. The King of Giants laughed derisively. "Let me ask you in return. Why do you think the denizens of chaos and the monarchs who rule them are one and the same?" He wore a solemn expression befitting a king. "The denizens of chaos exiting from these gates are all defeated troops. They were captured by the armies of the rulers and broken after living in captivity for an eternity. But I am a king. I am different from them. I have been patiently waiting to escape the ruler's grasp." The king laughed wistfully. "And so here we are." Jinwu tried to take in the information as objectively as possible. If he truly is on a different tier from other magic beasts, Jinwu might finally get some answers for once. He swallowed hard at the thought. There were so many questions he wanted to ask. But first, there was one thing Jinwu needed to confirm. By any chance, the ruler's armies, do they have wings and wear silver armor? Indeed, those are the ruler's soldiers. It was as Jinwu suspected. He felt like a puzzle piece had been slotted into the right spot. He began to suspect that the footage the angel statue had shown him was an actual memory and not something manufactured. What in the world was going on? Jinwu asked. Why do these rulers keep sending creatures to us? In other words, he wanted to know why gates existed. With that knowledge, he might be able to keep them from spawning to begin with. So that was his biggest concern. I've already told you, haven't I? The monarch declared. They are preparing for a war. A war? They're trying to transform this world into a battlefield and challenge the monarchs once more. I don't understand. What does that have to do with sending monsters to Earth? True, it did turn the world into something far worse than a war zone. Jinwu recalled the gruesome incident at Jaina's school, but that involved humans, not non-human entities. Why, it's to bring mana into your world. Jinwu felt like someone had smacked him on the back of the head. Everybody, both hunters and civilians alike, believed that if magic beasts were curses from the gates, then magic powers were blessings. Magic and essence stones had become excellent sources of energy. So to hear it was actually a precursor to a war? The King of Giants continued. The rulers determined that the best way to bring mana into a world in which it hadn't existed before would be to spill the blood of those who had it. What better way than to sacrifice their captives? Needless to say, the world had become denser and denser with mana over the years. This was not a natural phenomenon, but rather, the fruit hanging from the trees planted in the soil watered with the blood of magic beasts. Mana makes the world stronger. The ruler's plan was to fortify your world in order to stop it from getting destroyed. And this so-called war, a rematch between the monarchs and the rulers that will turn the world you know into a living hell. A battle between the ruler's armies and the creatures that magic beasts used to be, just as Jinwu had witnessed in the memory. If the king was to be believed, then it really would be hell on earth. The king's face darkened. There isn't much time. Once it is discovered that the one who found me is you, both the monarchs and the rulers will mobilize. It's possible their envoys are already on the move. You keep making it sound like they're after me. Why is that? You really don't know anything. The king sounded like he'd pitted Jin Wu. The power you possess isn't actually yours. Jin Wu nodded in agreement. The abilities of the Shadow Monarch had been given to him by the system, so he had no grounds to protest that. But the fact you now wield it is evidence that the original owner betrayed the other monarchs. That tracked with what the angel statue had said. It had most likely been a denizen of chaos that served the monarchs. As Jin Wu ran through more questions in his head, the King of Giants spoke up. You've become the enemy of both the monarchs and the rulers. But I alone swear that I will stand by your side and fight for you. So will you help me? The King of Giants was convinced that would be enough to persuade Jin Wu. However, the hunter had another suggestion. If that's the case, it would be better if you were one of my shadow soldiers. The King of Giants shuddered, caught off guard. For a split second, he saw Shadow Monarch in a human. He wasn't wrong. It would be better for Jin Wu to have a loyal subordinate instead of a stranger for an ally. The king was impressed that Jin Wu had thought of that. The monarchs and rulers have astral bodies. Once an astral body dies, it vanishes and cannot be made into a shadow. So I cannot become one of your soldiers. Jin Wu nodded. I see. That was why the king hadn't even considered the possibility of being turned into a shadow soldier. The oath of sincerity guaranteed he was speaking the truth. After some thought, Jin Wu finally looked up. Do you feel you have enough reason to help me? Asked the king. Jin Wu stared at him. The King of Giants appeared confident he would be released from his chains. Jin Wu wasn't someone who wanted to see others suffer, nor did he have a reason to decline his offer to be an ally. However, why did he feel so uneasy? I'm missing something. Jin Wu had to figure it out. He broke into a cold sweat. The king pleaded to him once again. Please unchain me. Jin Wu let out a deep sigh. No matter how much he debated, he couldn't think of a single reason to refuse the king's favor. Maybe he was overthinking things. Am I being paranoid? Jin Wu approached the captive king with a demon monarch's dagger in hand. They exchanged nods, and with one strike, the mana-infused dagger effortlessly severed one of the chains. Ba-dump, be-a-dump, be-a-dump. His heart was having a fit. Jin Wu had already made up his mind, so why the apprehension? Clank. He cut a second chain. The King of Giants remained stoic as his shackles fell one by one. The third chain. Clunk. Jin Wu leaned in to cut the chain rooted in the king's back. Ba-dump. His heart sank, but why? What had he missed? Thoughts raced through his mind like a raging river crashing onto rocks. Jin Wu stopped working on the chains and looked at the king. You said you'd be on my side, right? Of course. If you help me, I'll help you. This is a legal and binding agreement between monarchs. Jin Wu had heard this response several times already, but there was one other thing he wanted to confirm. In that case, are you on the side of humans? The king was silent. The oath of sincerity prevented the King of Giants from responding. Jin Wu looked at the back of the king's neck, and the black essence stone stuck there, cold and shiny. For as long as the essence stone was a part of him, the king would have to obey the rulers just like any other magic beasts, including their order to kill humans. Murderous intent flowed from the king as he aimed for Jin Wu's temple with his freed right hand. But the chains kept Jin Wu just out of reach. Jin Wu in turn ducked and plunged his dagger into the king's chest. Shunk! Despite being draped in chains, Jinwoo's dagger went in deep. Gaw! The king of giants coughed out blood. But that wouldn't be good enough. It was too dangerous to let him live. This magic beast might become another curse to the planet. With that final decision, Jinwoo repeatedly stabbed the king in the chest while avoiding his attacks. Shunk, 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 shunk. The king finally stopped moving after the sixth strike. It was over. Jinwoo retrieved his dagger. The king of giants looked him straight in the eyes and smiled. It's too bad, but it seems this is the end. Jinwoo took a step back and shook the blood from his dagger. The king continued, as the conflict between the citizens of your world and the denizens of chaos grows more intense, it will become more and more of a battlefield. Cough. The king coughed up blood again and smiled one last time. May all that you wish to protect burn to ashes. That won't happen. Jinwoo cut off the king's sentence as well as his head. Shhhhk. You have defeated the master of the dungeon. With his last breath, the king of giants released a tidal wave of magic power out into the human realm. The transformation of the world had begun. A few days prior to the king's death, a helicopter belonging to the Hunter Command Center landed on the grounds of a luxurious mansion. Takakakaka. The owner of the mansion had been enjoying a late lunch, but he stopped cutting his steak. No one told me we were expecting visitors. I'll go see who it is, sir. His manservant bowed and hurried away. Upon spotting the two people who emerged from the helicopter, the owner frowned. Well, that's troubling. The housekeeper clearing the dishes raised an eyebrow at his words. The dignified gentleman sitting at the table was Christopher, Chris Reed, one of the 5 greatest hunters in the world. He was a man better known as the National Level Hunter than by his actual name. Who could possibly trouble him? His manservant rushed back into the room. Mr. Reed, I know. Chris cut him off and quietly rose to welcome the middle-aged man who next entered the room. Long time no see, Mr. Connor. And Chris's gaze turned to the lady standing behind the assistant director. Mrs. Sellner. It was already unusual for Michael Connor, the assistant director of the Hunter Command Center, to pay him a surprise visit, but things had to be dire for Mrs. Sellner to accompany him. The assistant director rubbed his chin as he anxiously looked around. I have something important to talk to you about. Could you please have everyone else leave the room? Chris's hunch had been spot on. Had the assistant director come alone, Chris would have punished him for disrupting his pleasant morning and made him wait a few hours before seeing him. However, he could not be rude to Mrs. Sellner. After a pregnant pause as Chris took a swig of wine, he gestured for his manservant to approach and murmur, Make sure no one comes near this room until they leave. Yes, sir. The manservant nodded and sent everyone, including the housekeeper, out of the room. He was the last to leave, bowing again and quietly closing the door at Chris's nod. Only Chris, Michael, and Mrs. Sellner remained in the spacious chamber. The master of the house scanned the 2 uninvited guests and smirked. Here, the second in command of the top organization in America was the lowest person present. Chris was a national-level hunter, and Mrs. Sellner and her augmenting abilities were priceless. Oh my, where are my manners? Christopher couldn't let these honored guests stand. He quickly pulled out 2 chairs. Please have a seat. Michael and Mrs. Sellner sat next to each other, and Chris took a seat across from them. So, the national-level hunter looked back and forth between them with a smile. What brings you 2 out here? Mrs. Sellner glanced at the assistant director, who nodded. Before she could speak, though, Chris raised his hand. Let me just say, his expression made his displeasure clear. If you come here because of the S-rank gate on the East Coast, I'm not interested. His tone made it clear there was no room for argument. As you both know, the U.S. government has granted me national-level status. Therefore, I have the right to reject any of their requests, and I've already informed them of my decision not to participate in the raid. A national-level hunter wasn't just an ordinary citizen of a country. They were living nations unto themselves and treated as such, which meant civic duty wasn't in their vocabulary. Of course, they would cooperate when the occasion called for it, but since all the S-rank hunters in the country were teaming up for this raid, Chris didn't feel the need to lend a hand this time. He had no intention of changing his mind even if the assistant director had brought Mrs. Sellner here to entice him. But Mrs. Sellner wasn't concerned with the gate either. That's not why I'm here, Chris. There's a more serious issue. Japan was on the brink of extinction because of an S-rank gate, but there was a problem more urgent than an S-rank gate appearing on U.S. soil. Chris leaned in. What is this so-called issue? She hesitated, then spoke with difficulty. Chris, someone is going to kill you in the near future. The room fell silent. No wonder the assistant director couldn't stop fidgeting and dabbing the sweat from his brow. Mrs. Sellner, Chris spoke in a low voice. I haven't forgotten the favor you did for me. Thanks to her ability, he had become much more powerful, surpassing a limit he never thought he could exceed. But that didn't mean she could look down on him. Exactly who would be murdering whom? Who would dare harm a national-level hunter? Cats don't pick fights with lions. Only another lion could kill a lion, but Chris was confident that a lion like him could beat other lions regardless. This was another reason why he didn't want to participate in the raid. Why would a lion join a bunch of cats? Only a second-class lion like Thomas Andre would bother with such trivialities. Although she could see the anger rising in Chris, Mrs. Sellner continued her explanation. I had a dream about you not too long ago. A dream? Yes. She nodded. Chris was dumbfounded. In the dream, you were surrounded by some men and... Mrs. Sellner! Chris couldn't stand it anymore. Did you really come all the way here to bother me with nonsense? It's not nonsense. I'm aware of what kind of work you did before you awakened. Some individuals believe that Mrs. Sellner's unique power came from her being a psychic, but in Chris's opinion, her previous employment was no excuse for this drivel. His face contorted. I'm a national-level hunter. No one can kill me. But in the dream, that damn dream. Chris sighed deeply and nodded. Fine. Let's assume I believe what you're saying, and there are enemies out there who can kill me. Now what? Who should I ask for help if this is all true? Should he call the police or ask the Hunter Command Center for protection against an enemy who could potentially eliminate a national-level hunter? Ridiculous. Chris sneered. Ultimately, there's nothing I can do, is there? After some thought, Mrs. Sellner replied, There may be one person who can help you. And who would that be? Hunter Jin Woo-sung. He may be able to protect you. Jin Woo-sung? Chris had been ready to reject any suggestions, but the familiar name gave him pause. Where had he heard it before? It had been recently. Is it that? Chris frowned. Do you mean that Asian hunter who went to handle the dungeon break in Japan? Yes, that's Hunter Jin Woo-sung. Mrs. Sellner had seen the nearly unlimited power dormant within Hunter Sung, a power that might even surpass that of the national-level hunters. She was sharing all this with Chris because she was sincerely worried about him. But the proud hunter took it as an insult. Bam! He inadvertently slammed his fist down on the table, causing it to sink into the floor. Leave, Sellner! Now! He sprang to his feet and jabbed his finger at the door. Wait. I need to tell. Michael tried to assuage Chris's fury but balked. We should go. Michael escorted out a reluctant Mrs. Sellner. The waiting manservant ran in after seeing the broken table. What happened, Mr. Reed? Nothing. The master of the house shook his head. Things would have ended very differently had the other party not been Mrs. Sellner, the woman to whom he owed a huge debt. He took a deep breath to calm himself. Me? Ask some no-name Asian hunter for help? How dare she look down on Christopher Reed? Chris turned to address his startled manservant, who quickly regained his composure. Is there something you need, sir? That hunter, Jin Woo-sung. When did they say he's going to start the raid? The news about Japan had made headlines all over the world, including in the US. Jin Woo's name had become as synonymous with the dungeon break in Japan as the giants running rampant. The manservant looked at his watch and calculated the time difference. I believe he is set to arrive in Japan in an hour. An hour. Chris consoled himself with the thought that he at least had something to amuse himself with as he glared at the helicopter carrying Michael and Mrs. Sellner away. You have defeated the master of the dungeon. What? The king of giants lost his head. Jin Woo jumped back to avoid the blood gushing from his neck. Ping. Jin Woo assumed it was the usual notification from the system, but the contents turned out to be rather unusual. You have defeated one of the 9 monarchs, Regia, monarch of the beginning. Your experience points are being calculated. This may take a moment given the large amount of experience points received. What? This had never happened before, but there was no need to worry. Ping, 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 ping. The electronic chime rang non-stop as a slew of system notifications appeared. You have leveled up. 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 Jin Woo's eyes shot open at the grand total of 8 messages. Stab window. Level 122. Whoa! Jin Woo gasped at his new level. He had reached level 100 after defeating the ants, but it had taken the longest time for him to level up again afterward, probably due to the difference in strength between him and the magic beasts. He had barely reached level 103 after receiving permission by some of the guilds to clear a few high-ranked dungeons. But thanks to the giants and their kind, he now surpassed level 120. Awesome. Jin Woo nodded. Killing the king had been the correct decision. It was no coincidence that his level had gone up by 8. Despite being restrained by special chains, the monarch still had enough mana to steal the hunter's breath away. Jin Woo shuddered to think of such a creature loose in the world. Good thing he'd realized the beast's true colors before then. The king's corpse suddenly cracked like dry earth, turned to sand, and disintegrated into dust. Jin Woo recalled his explanation. Once an astral body dies, it vanishes and cannot be made into a shadow. So I cannot become one of your soldiers. Jin Woo had witnessed the death of an astral body for the first time. The king had been telling the truth. No black smoke or message regarding shadow extraction emerged from the sand. Jin Woo dug out the black essence stone and dusted it off. It sucks that I can't make a new shadow soldier, but at least I get to take this. His face was reflected in the clear, mirror-like surface of the essence stone. As he stared at it, the powerful energy stored inside made his fingers tingle. So the rulers are the ones who keep sending these here. Curiously, whenever he had heard the word rulers, a certain scene of 4 angels descending from the heavens would play in his head. Even though it wasn't real, the sight of them still gave him chills, and it felt like his heart dropped into his stomach. Maybe those guys were the rulers. Jin Woo wouldn't be able to stand against those creatures if they turned up now. He clenched the essence stone in his hand. I need to get even stronger. In that sense, Jin Wu was lucky enough to have acquired the power of the Shadow Monarch. He had unimaginable power, and the potential to gain more. He wondered what would have happened if he'd been deemed unworthy due to a lack of points during the job change quest. Jin Wu quietly spoke to the status window open before him. "Hey, say something already." There was no response. Having a conversation with the system was definitely on his bucket list. Jin Wu stood, and his foot hit something as he turned. Clink. Huh? He looked down to see the chains that had bound the King of Giants. These might come in handy. Jin Wu carefully grabbed hold of a chain still connected to the wall. Sure enough, he could feel his power being siphoned away. Oh! The chain was absorbing his mana. One might have been escapable, but even a mighty being would have had difficulty escaping with several of these wrapped around them. Jin Wu grinned as he watched his mana decrease little by little on the stat window. Don't mind if I do. He gleefully summoned a demon monarch's dagger and cut the chains one by one, but then realized he couldn't detect any drainage from the severed chains. What? The same thing was happening to all of them. What's going on? Jin Wu looked at the wall, then grabbed a chain connected to it again, confirming that it was siphoning mana as intended. He had an idea what was happening. So it's like that, huh? The chains themselves weren't the artifact. The draining effect came from the power of the dungeon, which meant that the chains were nothing more than scrap metal once removed. No use bringing these then. Jin Wu dropped them on the ground. He was a little disappointed, but even without the chains, he'd achieved a lot. During this raid, he recruited giants for his shadow army, and his level had gone up to 122. It was everything he'd hoped for and more. Jin Wu ditched the chains and turned around with a smile. Baru bowed, then pointed toward the exit. At his signal, the army before Jin Wu parted and cleared a wide path. Jin Wu patted the now clean Baru on the shoulder and headed toward the exit. Touched by this gesture, Baru followed his king, and behind him marched the 1,000 soldiers who had contributed so much to the fight in perfect unison. Stomp, 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 stomp. The soldiers' heavy footsteps echoed through the dungeon. Jin Wu smiled as he spotted the sunlight streaming in from the exit. It signaled the end of the long battle against the giants.